let's create a vintage photo effect. So I'm going to open a new photo in Photoshop. To start, if you placed or opened a JPEG in Photoshop, you're going to end up with a locked layer. So I'm going to double click on the background layer, and good idea to name this one car. So now it's unlocked and I'll be able to do some edits on this. We're going to first start by reducing the color of the photo. So we're going to add what's called an adjustment layer. So down at the bottom here in the icons, I'm going to click the adjustment layer options. I'm going to choose hue and saturation. So by doing this, I'm going to create sort of a sepia tone. The number one thing here to remember is to click colorize. So select the colorize option in the lower portion of the panel, and then look for a hue somewhere maybe around 40. And again, it's all up to you. It's your personal preference. You can increase the saturation, decrease the saturation as well. Okay, so with that new sepia tone effect, what we're going to do is make a new layer now with these two merged, and it's going to become a glow. Okay, so to do this, I need to go in my menu for my layers, my little drop down menu, look for merge visible, but before you click it, hold down your option or your Alt key. So what this will do is make a copy from those two layers, and there it is. Okay, so I'm again rename this so we keep myself organized. We're going to call this glow. So if I turn off these other layers, you can see that it's just its own layer. This is the car. If I turn off the adjustment layer, you can see what's happening here, how we're building it. So the glow layer, what we're going to do is put a blur on it. So with the glow layer selected, I'm going to go up to my filter menu at the top, look for blur, and under blur, we're going to look for Gaussian blur. Okay, so Gaussian blur pops up, and I'm going to zoom out here just so I can see my whole image. It's blurred quite a bit. And the amount here will depend on the size or resolution of your photo. So I'm going to just bring her down a little bit. It's a good idea to have preview checked so you can kind of see. And again, personal preference here, you can try it. If you don't like the effect, we can always go back and redo this one. So I'll click OK somewhere around 4.5-ish pixels. It's quite blurred. We'll see how this turns out. So what I do want to do and make sure that the blending mode of this layer is set to overlay. So blending mode, again, how everything on this layer will interact with everything on down. So right here are the blending modes. I make sure again that layer is selected, and we're going to choose, and you can see how different effects will occur, which some of them are really fun, but we're going to go to overlay. Okay. And now if you need to, you can actually change the opacity a little bit. You can see how blur versus kind of less. So we'll just hang around there. Again, all editable later on. So that's my glow layer. Now let's darken the edges of the photo. A lot of times old photography, the edges are a little bit darker. So I'm going to create a new layer down here at the bottom of the layers panel. Let's just name this right away to edges. Okay, and with edges, what I need to do is fill it with black. Now, if your foreground background color are set to the default, you'll have a black foreground color. So there's a quick key. You can do a edit, fill it with a color, and you can choose foreground background color. Or you can do a quick key on your keyboard, Command Delete, fills it with the background color, Option or Alt Delete, fills it with the foreground color. So making sure that layer again is the active layer, I'm going to choose whether you're on a Mac or a PC, Option or Alt Delete fills it with black. Okay. And so now with that filled with black, we are going to find the elliptical marquee tool, and that's below the rectangular marquee tool. This is a little bit of a tricky part because I'm not able to see my selection when I'm dragging, when it's on this black. But if I start up here in the top left corner, click and drag diagonally, trust it's happening, to the bottom right, let up, then I see my elliptical. It doesn't have to be perfect because we are going to do some blends on it as well. So here we go with an elliptical marquee selection. And what I'm going to do is mask out so that I can see my picture through the interior. The area around the elliptical will remain black. So to do that, what I need to do is add a mask. But I'm going to hold down my Option or my Alt key when I create a layer mask, again, down here in the bottom of my Layers panel. And the reason why I hold down my Alt or my Option key is so that I get the mask with the right coloring. So my black is in the middle, lets me see through it. My white is around the outside, that's where I'm seeing the black. So it's kind of a play on black and white, but you want it to look like this so that then you see the black corners. Okay, and so from here, what we need to do is we're gonna blur this again. So we're gonna go back up to Filter and back to Blur and a Gaussian blur. And again, you can play with whatever your preference is. This one I'm going to bring out quite a bit more because I want just a very faded out edge, something like that perhaps, and click OK. All right, so that's my edge. Now let's go ahead and sort of dirty up the photo. We're going to add some dust, scratches, maybe some texture over top. So to add dust and scratches, we're going to start with just a noise layer. So again, back to the new layer. All right, I'm going to name this one Noise so I can keep these organized again, because I may want to at the end end up turning something off or playing with the opacity. And by the way, back to the edges, I can lower the opacity too if that feels a little heavy, which it maybe does. I'll bring that down just a slight amount, maybe around 75 is good for the edges. Okay, back to the noise. So again, we are going to fill this with black. So that's my Option or Alt and Delete key. Fill it with black. You're making sure your noise layer is the active layer. Okay, with my noise layer active, we are going to add some noise. So back up to the filter menu, and here's the noise. And add noise. Okay, so we're going to add a bunch of sort of static is what it is. And again, the amount you can play with. And it will just depend kind of on what your size is of your photo, the dimensions, resolution, and how much noise you really want. So I'm going to not have a ton. I do want to make sure that Gaussian is selected and monochromatic is also selected. And go ahead and click OK. So after I have filled this with noise, I'm going to change my blending mode on this layer now to a new one. We're going to use Soft Light. You can see again how it's playing with it. Here's Soft Light. Again, feels quite a bit heavy, so I'm going to take my opacity and I'm going to bring that down. And you can just kind of, it gets kind of that grainy feel. All right, let's make another, and this time let's actually add some grain. So we're going to call this new layer Grain. Again, this all becomes more of a personal preference. I'm going to fill this with black again, my Option Delete key. Let's head back up to Filter. This time we're adding a texture, and you'll notice that texture is not listed in this lower portion, so we need to go to our Filter Gallery. Okay, Filter Gallery, it'll be the last one, maybe not open, you may be collapsed, you'll have to open it, and you're looking for Grain. And here you can play with the intensity and the contrast. You can see how if I make this more intense, I get more lines, less intense. And then the contrast. I do want to make sure this is vertical. Okay, so you have a vertical linear. You can play with these others, but the vertical seems to be the best effect for these older photos. Okay, so I'm going to click OK. And this time on this grain layer, I'm going to change my blending mode to Screen. And Screen is a fun one because it sort of does the reverse. So if I go back to normal, it's black with white stripes. If I go to Screen, it becomes transparent in those black areas and the black stripes become white. Okay, so, and again, I can play with my opacity, bring that down a bit. It feels a little heavy. Another way, if I don't like these effects, another thing that I can do to kind of roughen up, make my photo look like it has some dust and scratches and marks and stains, is add a texture. So again, I can go and find a copyright-free photo of paper, crinkled paper, of some just different surface textures. You can create your own by taking pictures of textures and then overlaying. I saw a really fun effect back many years ago where they took pictures of bread and then the slices of bread where you could see the texture of the bread, and then they overlaid that on photos, which was really interesting. I have a wrinkled paper that I'm going to just drag. So it's a JPEG, and I'm dragging it on top of my Photoshop document here that's open. It will place it, all right? And before I click check or do anything else, I'm going to right click and I'm going to rotate this. So I'm rotating it and I'm going to stretch it out. Again, however, you want this to be, I can really scale it up if I don't want to have, all of the tightness and that wrinkles. Okay, so with that, then again, I can play with my opacity and blending mode. So I could do, and I would explore, because it depends on the texture that you're using. But probably a multiply might work. It might get a little dark, so you might want to do multiply and play with the opacity so it's not as heavy. I can still see in some of the areas that wrinkled, but it's not overly distracting. Multiply, or you can use screen. So sometimes the screen works well as to do that. Again, depending on your colors, this is not working because there's a lot of dark. So let's look at overlay. Overlay sometimes does a really good job too with how it's blending. And again, I would take this opacity and definitely bring it down a little bit. Okay, so that's one effect. Let's undo that or turn it off. Let's drag in, this is a really neat one with a water stain. So again, before I do anything, I'm going to right click. I'm going to rotate this so that it's a landscape. I could continue to rotate it if I wanted that stain, say, in a different area. And depending, I could really scale this up and then just relocate it so I see this portion mainly. And this one, again, we're going to play with either multiply or overlay for the blending mode. Okay, so I like that effect because it's there, but it's not really. And so you can, add more of these. Now this one seems a little heavy. We can reduce that even more. I could add my noise back. Again, feels maybe a little heavy. Let's take the opacity and reduce it a little bit. So all up to you and your personal preference, but that is an easy way to make a photo look old. Now the last thing, if I do want to fade this, so a lot of times photos do fade over time. So I'm going to go back up to the top here and I'm going to do one more adjustment layer. And this adjustment layer, I'm going to use levels. So levels does get a little tricky. It's a histogram showing my pixel count in the color range. So what I'm going to do is actually look at this output level here towards the bottom. Now, if I bring this slider to the right, what I'm basically doing is I'm cutting off the darkest pixels. The black pixels are going to go away, and you can see it kind of lights up. Let's do extreme. See how my black is not going to be there. There it is. So I'm going to go in just a slight amount. Same thing, but reversal, getting rid of some of the highlights. So there are already not many pixels up here, but they're more in the middle range. But let's bring this in a little bit, and you can see how it just becomes more dim. Again, over extreme to see kind of what's happening there. Okay, so that's going to dim my photo. It's going to fade it out a little bit so the colors aren't as much contrast in them. Last, if it feels like we've lost too much color, we can go back to the very beginning here to this hue and saturation. So our hue and saturation adjustment layer, and basically I can turn this down a little bit. So if I feel like it's too washed out, I can take this opacity, and by bringing the opacity down, I'm letting the color come through, sort of as a reversal of thinking. So here's my car color sort of coming back through. All right, so that's a way that I can make a current photo look old.